All righty, take 30 more seconds if you're still going. Wonderful. Did anybody, just anybody want to shout out what their least favorite subject in school was? Maths, hands up if it was maths. Oh, there's a significant number of you who don't like numbers. Well, anybody else who was something other than maths? English. Anybody who was, English was the thing? Yeah? No, do we have anything outside of English and maths? Social studies. And where I grew up, we that paired in with history. And I was going to say that how many of you loved history class in high school? Yeah, there's about 5 of you. You know, it's 6. I found that history is one of those things that people either love or they hate. But what the thing that really blows my mind about history is that there is no bad history class. There's just unfortunate history teachers, I think. Because history is fascinating. And I'm super excited about the topic for tonight because Robbie's going to share some more about some timelines that were given prophetically or as predictions, as we learned a little bit about last night, and how those match in with some historical events. And so I'm super excited to learn about that. And so without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Robbie Berghan to the stage. And we'll do that with a warm welcome. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Robbie. With a Y, that's right. I hated English. I was just saying, I couldn't stand it. And my main reason was I had a bad teacher, and they didn't do very well at teaching me grammar and all the logic and stuff, so I just found it horrible. But then connected with that was history. Couldn't stand history either. And then the ironic thing is that tonight we'll be talking about English and history. So put your seatbelts on, we'll get ready for it. So I want to tell you a story. So this is part 3, okay? So put it on the screen there. Part 3, we're looking at prophetic codes and timelines. Last night we looked at 2 presentations. The first one was sort of why I've even got something to share that might be of interest to someone else. It boggles my mind that for someone that was an introvert at school, introvert in my early years, that's why I was a programmer, because I could sit behind a screen and didn't have to deal with people, that someone like me would have something that people wanted to listen to. But it turns out that there's a lot of people that I've met around the country and around other countries around the world who have had similar experiences. In fact, last night I met 2 other people who had very similar experiences to, if you were there last night, I talked about the 3 encounters that I had, the mirror, shadowy thing, and then the storm and that stuff. I met 2 other people here last night that had similar experiences. So it's fascinating that there's something that's common in the human story. So that was the first presentation. Second presentation was to show you one really important thing, not to scare you. Some of you said you were scared. That's okay. It wasn't to scare you, though. It was to show you that this thing that is called the Bible, today we call it the Bible in English, but it's really 2 parts. There's an Old Testament part, which is a Hebrew Bible, or the Hebrew text, and there's a New Testament part, which was written after the coming of Jesus. The point of last night's presentation was this book makes some incredible claims. One claim is that God of the universe, the only one, is the author of it. And then it says, here's how you can test it. If you study the predictions of the future, and they are accurate to how they were predicted, it will prove that the author of the book is divine. That was the first clue. The second clue was, we saw that prophecy in the book of Revelation written almost 2,000 years ago, and it talks about, among many, many things, one little characteristic about a time that the world will come into where there will be a mechanism of global economic control to enforce people's views and behaviors. And what we saw last night is that for the first time in 2,000 years, as recent as 2018 to 2024, we are now living in the time where that prophecy no one's actually laughing about or scoffing about. They're actually going, wow, this looks like what we're reading in the newspapers. So that's all great and well, but I want to go back to, in this presentation, and I want to show you where my faith experiment starts. And it's going to start with history, because that was one of the subjects I didn't like in school, so you're going to have to sit through it now for a little bit. But I trust it will be interesting. So I want to take you back to this guy. His name's Kaiser Wilhelm II. He was the German emperor that eventually got Germany into World War I. There's a lot of controversy around why World War I started. Some people blame the Serbians for assassinating the Austrian princes. But whatever the reason was, Kaiser Wilhelm was instrumental in World War I. Now, Kaiser Wilhelm, being the German emperor, he was approached on one occasion by the priests of this cathedral. It's called Metz Cathedral. It's currently in Metz, which is in France. But before World War I happened, it was a part of Germany. After the World War happened, and they decided to redraw the maps. They keep drawing real borders and maps and things in Europe. So now it's in France, but this used to be in Germany. And the owners or the custodians of this cathedral, they needed the roof repaired. And so they went to the emperor and said, "Emperor, we would like you to pay for our roof to be repaired." The emperor said something remarkable, which is connected to our topic tonight. This is what he said. He said, "There is a statue on the cathedral." This is the actual statue right here. And it's of the prophet Daniel. Now remember, if you were here last night, we looked at one prophecy from the book of Daniel, from Daniel chapter 8. And we saw how it predicted that Alexander the Great would conquer the Medo-Persians. Well, this is the same prophet Daniel that's got a sculpture in the front of the cathedral. Now, this is what Kaiser Wilhelm II said to the custodians of the cathedral. They said, "If you get that face, this is what I want you to do. I want you to remove the head of Daniel, and I want you to replace it with mine, and then I will give you the money to fix the roof." Now, don't you find that really bizarre? If you actually go there today, it does look like the face has been changed. And so this point of why would Kaiser Wilhelm, the Emperor of Germany, why would he demand that they remove the head of Daniel the prophet and replace it with his own? Well, this is why. He tells us why. This is what Kaiser Wilhelm said. He said, "Daniel's prophecy does not fit with my plans. I can't accept that. Where Charlemagne and others have failed, I will succeed." So here is the Emperor of Germany, pre-World War I. He's had a request to repair the cathedral roof, and he says, "I'll only do it if you get rid of Daniel's head, because Daniel's standing there as a prophet of the statue in this church. It irritates me because I can't accept his prophecy." So the question is, what prophecy in a dusty old book could be so devastating that the Emperor of Germany wants to remove the head off a statue? So we're going to look at this particular prophecy this evening. It comes from, as the title suggests, from a prophet by the name of Daniel. Now, Daniel is a Hebrew. He lives around about the 600 BC, so about 6th century BC. And he writes a 12-chapter scroll that you'll find in your Bible called the Book of Daniel. There's 12 chapters. 6 chapters are historical. They talk about stories. And then 6 chapters talk about prophecies. And there's sort of a meshing between the two sections. So something that this Daniel wrote down infuriated the Emperor of Germany. So when I came across this in my quest to understand this book and what the beliefs are about this book, I wasn't trying to understand it so I could be a believer. I was understanding it to see what the religious fanatics calling themselves Christians are going to try and accomplish before the end of the world. That was where this journey started. By the way, if you want to know all the details of my story, some of you asked me just before, if you go to the website faithfm.com.au, look for the faith experiment, you'll find my whole story there. And I talk a great detail on all sorts of things, like how my fiancée threatened to kill herself if I didn't become an atheist again, and all this sort of weird stuff. Anyway, it's an interesting story. So back to Daniel. So Daniel lives around 6th century BC, and as I said, he has many predictions in there that don't just deal with his time, but they come all the way down to the end of time or concern our time. So I want to give you a real quick whirlwind tour through the book of Daniel. It starts off in chapter 1 with a story about this thing known as the Babylonian captivity. Basically what happens is that Daniel's in Jerusalem, there's a bunch of people there, they upset the Babylonians, and a guy called Nebuchadnezzar, which when I read it in the Bible the first time, I was like, oh, that's the name of the ship in The Matrix, the movie. There's a ship that they're all it's called the Nebuchadnezzar. I was like, oh, I knew that name, but didn't realize it was in the Bible. So Nebuchadnezzar comes along to Jerusalem, and he kidnaps a bunch of people and takes them over to Babylon and makes them his educated slaves. He trains them up in the ways of Babylon, and he uses them in a way to ensure that Babylon will be forever the conqueror of Israel. So the captivity happens in chapter 1, but when you get to chapter 2, the whole chapter is basically a story about a disturbing dream. So this is where, if you're reading this from an Australian perspective, you're like, okay, here the fairy tales begin, which is exactly how I looked at the story. But since then, I've spent a lot of time in archaeology. I've been involved with that for now about 15 years, and it's fascinating why we discover that this account is recorded in the Hebrew scripture. Basically, here's the story. The king, Nebuchadnezzar, he goes to bed one night, and he has a terrifying dream. He wakes up in a sweat, but can't remember the dream. Then he calls his guards, and his guards go get the magicians and the astrologers and all the wise people to come and try and interpret his dream, right? But the problem is he can't remember the dream. And what we've found in archaeology is we've found literally thousands and thousands of these little clay tablets. I don't know if you can see it, but it's got cuneiform inscriptions on here. It's been broken here, obviously. But all the way along here are rows and rows of cuneiform. And what these stones, I was actually going to bring some replicas from my library, but I didn't have enough luggage on the plane. So just look at the picture. So this is a collection that's in the British Museum. I have this as a replica in my own collection. And this is known as a dream omen tablet. So basically what happens is that in the Babylonian realm, they would write out people's dreams, and then the wise people would interpret it, because in Babylonian belief system, a dream was the gods speaking to you about your future or your nation's future. So if you're the king of Babylon, you receive a dream, you wake up and you can't remember it, you're in big trouble, buddy. So this is the context. So if you just read the story, it's kind of like a fairy tale, how it starts off. But if you understand the culture of the day, and we now do know that, we can understand why. You imagine if you believe that you have received a dream from the gods, communication from the gods, and you forgot it, it'd be pretty devastating to you. And so that's sort of the context to the story. So next in the story is Daniel chapter 2. He calls the advisors, or the wise men, he calls the astrologers, and he calls the magicians. These are all considered the wise people in the supernatural crafts of Babylon. He brings them in and he says, I had a dream from the gods. I need you to tell me what I dreamt and then what it means. Now, apparently, according to the story, these guys had never had such a request in all their lives. They'd only received requests of, hey, I had a dream. I was in a grassy field by a stream and I saw a pretty girl walk past. What does it mean? And they would just tell you what they think it means. I'm actually quite good at this. Afterwards, if you want, come and tell me your dream and I'll tell you what it means. I'm really good at it. So in this particular case, something was different in that the dream wasn't remembered. So he tells them, listen guys, go and consult your tablets. By the way, this is a Babylonian astrology chart that we now have discovered, and we can tell how important this stuff was to these people. So it was a very big deal for the king to rely on these wise men and tell them the meaning and the interpretation of the dream. But the problem is, if you read the story, they say, no one has ever asked us to do such a thing. You tell us the dream, we'll tell you the interpretation. So the king's a little bit freaked out, to put it mildly, and he says, you're all getting your heads cut off, your families are going to get destroyed, and we're going to burn your houses so that they're like a pile of animal poop, is basically what it says in the Aramaic. So he's pretty mad that no one can remind him or tell him what the dream is he had, because the dream comes from the gods. So in the story, when he sends out this execution decree, they round up all of the wise men, the astrologers and the soothsayers and all these magicians and different sorts of people. But they also include another class of people that's not there in the story at the beginning. And the second class of people are the wise people who came from the captivity from from Jerusalem to Babylon. And that includes our main character of the story, which is Daniel. So Daniel is brought before the king, and Daniel says, "Why are you trying to kill us all?" And he says, "Because you guys can't tell me the dream." So Daniel does something pretty bold, and this is where the story gets interesting from someone who is an atheist. I'm looking at the story, and what you read next in the account is Daniel says, "There's someone who knows everything, and that someone is a God that my people know and have a relationship with. So here's what's going to happen, king. You're not going to kill us tonight. I'm going to go home tonight, and I'm going to talk to my God, and my God will give me the dream and the interpretation." Now, the king really does want to know the dream, so he says he got one night. So Daniel goes back home, and he turns to heaven for help. Now, I don't know, have you ever been on a plane where it just dropped? Like, I don't know, a couple of 100 feet, meters, whatever you want to measure it as, and then you just sort of feel that, oh. Have you ever been like that? What was the reaction of the people around you? That was a good rendition. I was on a plane one time flying into Bulgaria, into Sofia Airport, International Airport in Bulgaria. And as we were coming in, I was with my wife, and we were flying around, and they were coming in to do the landing like this. And as we came in, the whole plane just dropped, like it just dropped out of the sky. I mean, it didn't hit the ground, which was a good thing, but it dropped. And when it dropped, the oxygen mask came out, right? One of those sort of moments. Do you know what everyone on that plane started doing? "Dear Jesus, dear Jesus, dear Jesus, oh God, oh Jesus, oh God." They're all praying like frantic. I mean, I can see the runway. We're coming around. The funny thing is that whenever there's real crisis in life, the atheist in everyone disappears. And we see the similar thing with what's happening with Daniel. As soon as the crisis comes, Daniel goes, "Well, I know where to go for help. I'm just going to go to the guy upstairs." Because he knows all things, and he knows what he dreamt, and if he wants, he can tell me. So remarkably in the story, and this is the amazing part, as an atheist reading the story, this character Daniel, he claims that what comes next comes from God. He takes zero credit for himself. So you know what that means, right, based on last night's presentation? If it is claimed to come from God, then it is a piece of evidence to test. So here's what happens. In the dream, Daniel claims that God showed him a dream of this image. Now, this is an artist's representation of it, but it's basically the idea. It was a form of a man. It had a golden head, silver chest, bronze hips, iron feet, and you can't quite see it. The feet are made of iron and clay. So Daniel claims that he goes to sleep, and God gives him this dream, and he believes that it's the same dream that the king had. Not only does he get the dream, but he gets the interpretation of it. So the next day, he wakes up, he runs back to the king, and this is Daniel chapter 2, he turns to Daniel and to the king Nebuchadnezzar and says, "Listen, that God of heaven I told you about, he gave me the dream that you had." The king says, "Okay, I'm listening." So he proceeds to tell him what he dreamt. And as he's going through the description, you saw a great big image. It had a golden head, a silver chest, a bronze thing, and iron legs and iron clay feet. The king's on the edge of his seat. This is incredible. This is remarkable. This person had the same dream that I had. But that's not the reason he was super excited, because he wanted to know what the dream meant. So at the end of this story, of this great big image thing, there's a great big rock. You can hardly see it. There's a big rock that comes down. It hits the feet and breaks the whole thing into pieces. And that's the point that Nebuchadnezzar wakes up. So now Nebuchadnezzar's waiting now for the interpretation. Daniel turns to Nebuchadnezzar and he says, "I'll give you the interpretation. Here it is." So the king's on his edge of his seat. He says, "What you dreamt is the story of empires from yours to the last one." The king's listening. So now he begins with the interpretation. This is what he says. Chapter 2, verse 38, he says, "You are," so Nebuchadnezzar, who's the king of Babylon, "you are the head of gold." So immediately now we have a context that this image is going to represent some sort of a timeline. Does that make sense? Now, this timeline, it starts with the head, and the head is Babylon. Very clear. Now, remember, Daniel claims that this dream and interpretation comes from who? Which means when God says, hey, I'm going to tell you the future before it happens, and when it happens, you'll know that I'm God, this is an opportunity to test it. This is one of those 1800 plus prophecies. So Babylon, officially, Neo-Babylon, starts in 605 BC, and it runs all the way down to what? 539 BC. Now, if it's got an end date, what do you think that means? It means the empire comes to an end. But let's pause for a second. Babylon is known today in history and archaeology as the Golden Empire. What metal was its head? It was gold. And so we see this remarkable thing that even before we called it a Golden Empire, the Bible described it as a Golden Empire. Okay, but what happened to Babylon? Well, basically this is what happened. Nebuchadnezzar passes away. His son, what's his name now? I've forgotten now. I've gone blank. Anyway, he has a son, and he starts ruling, and he decides ruling isn't his thing, so he moves to Tamar in the Middle East, which is Saudi Arabia, and he places his son, which is Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, in control, and his name was Belshazzar. Belshazzar's having a party one night, and the next thing you know, up come the Medo-Persians knocking on the door and take over the place. So Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom came to an end. And I want you to notice what Daniel says next in the interpretation to Nebuchadnezzar. He says, but after you shall arise another what? Another kingdom. So now we know for sure these medals represent kingdoms on a timeline. So we're starting with Babylon, and now we end up with another kingdom. But notice this probably wouldn't have made Nebuchadnezzar very happy. In fact, it didn't. Because in the very next chapter, guess what he does? He builds a physical image of a man, and guess what metal he uses? He uses gold from head to toe, because he's just determined to make this prophecy of none effect. So he says there's another kingdom coming, but the good news is, if there is any to be good, it is what kind of kingdom? It's inferior. So we know something, that the peak was Babylon. The next one will conquer it, but it's going to be inferior. Does that make sense? Now, we know that in 539 BC, the Medo-Persians march on up the riverbed. They dried the river and diverted the water so they could march under the gates into Babylon, and they conquer the city and start a new empire, the Medo-Persian Empire. The ironic thing is that 700 years, or 7 BC, so about 300 years before, Isaiah, one of the other prophets in the Old Testament text, he was told by God, apparently, that a man called Cyrus was going to be the servant of God and conquer Babylon by name. And it's the same Cyrus that we have this Cyrus cylinder from today, from archaeology, which actually has Cyrus describing the decree and the events. It's fascinating. So when we come to our timeline, the head was Babylon, and now we're down here in a chest of arms of silver, which is now the kingdom of Medo-Persia. Exactly as a sequence would happen, we find the same story. And by the way, guess what Medo-Persia is famous for its metals? It's for silver. It's ironic, but that wasn't the end of it. Daniel turns to Nebuchadnezzar and he says, hey, here's the next thing that's going to happen though. Then another, what kind of kingdom? A third kingdom. So we're getting a timeline here. We're getting a sequence. It says, of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. So something's funny is happening. It goes from gold, which is the most valuable metal, to silver, which is less valuable than gold, to bronze, which is less valuable than silver. So the value is decreasing, isn't it? But gold is very soft. Silver is harder than gold. And bronze is harder than silver. Something's happening. It's getting harder and harder, but it's getting less valuable and less valuable. Now, does anybody know from their history classes who defeated the Medes and Persians? It was the character from our talk last night, Alexander the Great. In 331 BC, Alexander the Great comes on the world stage and he decides he has a goal to conquer the known world, which he does. And part of that is the Medes and the Persians. In fact, an interesting story, Alexander the Great, he was coming from, if you know where Greece is, he went up around, past Turkey, all around there, down through Syria, and came down through to Jerusalem on his way to go to Persia, which is Iran sort of area today. And as he's going across, he was determined to destroy Jerusalem. So Alexander the Great is on his way to Jerusalem to destroy it, and as he's approaching, all of these Jewish priests come out to meet Alexander the Great, and they say, "Stop." Alexander the Great, he says, "What?" He says, "I want to tell you something." These priests start talking, and the priests pick up the book of Daniel. They turn to chapter 8, and they tell him a story about a ram and a goat going to war. He says, "I'm listening." They continue to tell him the story of how the goat wins against the ram. He says, "I'm listening." And then they show him in Daniel chapter 8, in the Hebrew text, where it says that that goat that wins is Greece. Could you imagine being Alexander the Great? Being told by these weird people living in this place called Israel that their God told them 300 years before he was born that Greece was going to conquer the very enemy he's going over to conquer now. So as a result, guess what he did? "I'm going to leave you guys here, you Jerusalem people." He marches around Jerusalem and he goes over and defeats the Medes and Persians. But before he does, he says to the Jewish leaders, he says, "What I want you to do now is I want you to translate your holy text into Greek." That translation is called the Septuagint, which if you go study the Bible in Greek, you read that text today as a result of a prophecy from the book of Daniel. It's fascinating. So here's the rise of Greece. Greece comes and conquers the Medes and Persians, and we now see the third empire, which represented this bronze belly and thighs, as being the Greeks. This is phenomenal. We've gone from Babylon to Medo-Persia, now we've gone to Greece. But the dream hasn't finished. Daniel turns to the king and says, "This is what's going to happen next. And then the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron." Now, again, if you know any of your history, this is part I actually did know without having to look up the history books, as I must have been awake that day in history class in high school. The Iron Empire was Rome. So Rome comes on the world stage in 168 BC. They go from a city into a city-state into the biggest, largest empire this planet has ever been under control of. And we find that they are famous for, of all metals, iron. So every one of the metals that was used in the image is actually what we look back in history today and go, that's what each of those empires were famous for. They came in the right sequence, and they came in the right timing. Absolutely phenomenal. So these legs represent the legs or the kingdom of Imperial Rome. But you'll notice that I've got an expiration date for Imperial Rome, 476 AD. Something happened. Look what the prophecy predicted. The prophecy, Daniel goes on and says, the kingdom, so this is the fourth kingdom. So notice he says, you're the head of gold. After you will be a inferior kingdom, right? So that's two kingdoms now. Then it says there will be a third kingdom. That's three kingdoms now. Then there'll be a fourth kingdom. That's four kingdoms now, right? What's the fourth kingdom? Rome. But then notice what the prophecy says. It does something different. It says the kingdom shall be divided. I want you to notice that Rome doesn't get conquered. It falls. It doesn't conquer or get full. It divides. Which is very, very specific, because if you lived during any of that time, the kingdoms just get replaced. Tribes get replaced. Even in our great ancestry of the British and English Empire, they just replace people, replace colonies, replace civilizations, just replace. There's no dividing. And yet this prophecy was very specific. There'll be four successive kingdoms, and then there'll be a division. Okay, this is what it says. The division is made up of these feet. These feet have two characteristics. They have iron and they have clay. And when you look in the symbols of the Bible, the iron is obviously representative of the previous empire, which was Rome. And then the clay represents people. In fact, all the way through the Bible, God likens clay to his creation. For example, Isaiah says that God is the potter and we are the clay that the potter molds. King David in the Psalms talks about how we are like clay in his hands. So we've got this weird sort of environment taking place in these feet where we've got still Roman remnants, but it's mixing with God's people, mixing together. Very bizarre combination. And what we know happened in 476 AD, the Roman Empire as was known, it just sort of crumbled. And by 476, it was officially crumbled. And how did it crumble or divide? Well, it divides into 10 regions. It took about 50-something years, almost 100 years, for the crumbling to happen, but it happened. And what happened was, instead of being one unified big empire, now all these little regions and territories broke up and became their own little countries or territories that we call today things like the Franks, we call the Ostrogoths, the Heruli, the Anglo-Saxons. So these are the areas that Rome breaks up into, which were all the precursors to Western Europe today. So the Franks become the French, the Anglo-Saxons become the United Kingdom, and so on. And that happens all around Europe. Now, what's fascinating is that when you look at this dream, this king had a dream that was about 140 words long, the actual dream that Daniel tells him he had. The king's like, you got it. That's exactly what I dreamt. And when Daniel says, well, this is what God said you dreamt, and this is what God said it means, this is Nebuchadnezzar's response. He falls down and he says, your God is the God of all gods. But he hasn't finished yet, because what happens next is, he says, as you saw the iron mixed with iron and clay, or mixed with clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere one to another, just as iron does not mix with clay. The prediction goes on to say very specifically that after Rome divides into this Western Europe mess that we see all these divisions, there'll be an attempt, it says, to mingle, to come back together, but it says that they will not cleave one to another or adhere one to another. So you get the picture here. There's a division of the old Roman Empire into different states, and there's going to be an attempt to bring the states back together, but as much as they try, it will never happen. And so the claim is that there will never, ever, ever be a united Europe back into one regional empire. Now you say, Robbie, that's not true, is it? Notice this. Charlemagne was the first. Around 900 AD, he attempted to unify all of the fallen Roman Empire into the first empire after the division of Imperial Rome. And he was a member of he was like the emperor of the Catholic Church or the Holy Roman Empire at the time, trying to bring it all together. But it failed miserably. Then you had Charles V, you had Louis XIV, you had Napoleon, you had Kaiser Wilhelm II, you had Hitler and European Union. They've all been trying to bring Europe back together as one state, one empire. But what did that prophecy say? They will never cleave back together. You'll never unite back together. In fact, notice what Napoleon said. Napoleon said there will be one Europe. There will be one currency, there will be one language, there will be one government over all of Europe. Pretty bold statement I think he's a short man, not that there's anything wrong with short men. It was a pretty bold statement for his day and for his time. And then he goes and has a lot of battles and things. He has the Battle of Waterloo, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And in his diary, he wrote this after the defeat in Waterloo. He wrote, God Almighty is too much for me. Napoleon was doing his absolute everything in his might to bring Europe together into one empire, one language, one currency. And after his final defeat, he says, God Almighty is too much for me. Which brings us back to Kaiser Wilhelm. Why did he want Daniel's head removed and replaced with his? Because Daniel's prophecy stated that there would never be a superstate in Europe ever again. But Kaiser Wilhelm said, that doesn't fit with my plan. I want a unified continental empire once again. Did it happen? Well, we can look back in hindsight and see what happened to Germany in World War I, can't we? But the ironic thing is that there was another German that tried to do the same thing. And he said, Adolf Hitler said there'd be one people, one empire, and one leader. And I wonder who that leader was supposed to be. But the prophecy still remains. They will not adhere one to another. In fact, there are stories of German Bible students who were conscripted into Hitler's army. They weren't fighting for the cause, but if they didn't, they'd be dead. And there's hundreds of stories of people coming out of these people who were studying the Bible, of Daniel chapter 2, reading this exact prophecy, and they were saying to their superiors, we're not going to win this war because the Bible says we won't. And there are remarkable stories of platoon leaders who listened to these Christians who had these views of the Bible, and they started stockpiling fuel in the last few years of World War II, and it was because they were listening to that and stockpiling fuel, they were able to get out before the decimation of the German troops. People, even at that time, who knew these prophecies, believed that this was a God thing, that Germany wouldn't win. The Bible even goes on to say and says that they will try and unite Europe through marriage relationships. This is what it says. It says they will mix with one another in marriage, but just as they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. See, they thought that what if we take the princess from this country and the prince from this country and we marry them together, then they're not going to go to war and we'll have political alliances and it'll all be a great thing. Have you looked at Europe lately? There's a lot of crazy relationships there. In fact, if you go to Denmark, go to Frederiksberg Castle, in there are tapestries and tapestries lining hallways after hallways of all the relationships of who's married to which house from which country and who's got this. It's a mess. You know that all the English Westminster people, not Westminster, sorry, Windsor Castle and all the Queen, the former Queen, the current King and all that, you know that most of them are Germans, right? But it's all through blood and through marriage and trying to keep the peace and all those sorts of things. But has it worked? No, it hasn't. The latest experiment is the European Union. In fact, in the 1990s, the president of France, as the European Union was becoming an evolution of a trade sort of organization, and by 1995 they were planning to introduce the Eurodollar in 5 years, in the year 2000. And as they were doing this is what he said about the EU, the idea of the EU. He says, a great power is being born. His counterpart in Germany said, the course is now irreversible, that we'll be uniting together as a superstate. Trying to do the very thing that this prophecy said will never happen. The president of the European Commission, he said at that time, he said, we can and will succeed in creating a unified, prosperous, democratic European where citizens can live in peace and freedom. Well, that lasted, in theory, until Brexit. And there's the idea of Grexit, and there's the idea of all these other exits from the European Union. And so the question today is, will it continue to unite, or will it end up dividing? Well, the prophecy said that it will never be united again into a single one empire. But the prophecy goes on, and Daniel continues, and he remarks, he says, you watch now. So watch the chronology. He's starting at Babylon around 600 BC or 6th century BC, and he's following from King Nebuchadnezzar all the way down through history. He's seeing the outcome of his empire, then into the Medes and Persians' hands, then into the Greeks and into the Romans, and then into this divided state, and then this trying to get together and trying to form something out of iron and clay, which doesn't really seem to stick, and they're working hard. And then he says this, as you watched, while a stone was cut out without hands. That's Hebrew speak for something supernatural happens. There's no human hands involved in it. Something's happening. And notice what happens. This stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. At what time does this supernatural event happen? Does it happen during the head? No. The chest? No. The legs? You get the idea? No. Where does it hit? It hits on the feet. And what's the feet? It's the time of a divided Europe. And so this stone goes on to become a great mountain. It turns this image into pieces, and it becomes the thing of things, the mountain that fills the earth, a supernatural event. This is what we know as the last empire. It's the one that there's nothing else after it. And if you compare this to what the teachings in the New Testament say, this last empire is supposed to be, and again, I'm not expecting you to believe any of this, I'm just telling you what it says. It's supposed to be the second coming of Jesus. So according to the timeline, the second coming of Jesus is supposed to happen in a time when Europe is in division, which is pretty much any time in the last 60, 70 years. Remarkable. So in 140 words, 2,600 years of future history is given that runs from the Nebuchadnezzar's position in time all the way down to the second coming. And so if we look at this one prophecy, just one, there are 7 predictive elements in this prophecy. Here's what they look like. You have Babylon would come, Medo-Persia would come, Greece, Rome, divided Rome. There'd be an attempt to unite, it would fail, and then number 7 is a supernatural event, the last empire. Does that make sense so far, according to what the story says? Well, here's the crazy thing. 7 predictive elements. Of those 7 predictive elements, 6 have fulfilled precisely. Remember last night I showed you the 13 predictive elements from Daniel chapter 2. I showed you the predictive elements from Revelation chapter 13. Well, here's Daniel chapter 2. And if you look at this, let me ask you a question. If you were to make a bet for 7 things to happen precisely as they're predicted, and you got to the table late, and before you got there, prediction number 1, 100%. Prediction number 2, 100%. 3, 4, 5, 6, 100%. What's the chance? What are the odds? Let me make it more personal. What are you willing to bet that number 7 will be fulfilled too? This was my reality when I was studying this as a non-Christian, as a non-believer. I was like, it's kind of like Bitcoin. I missed Bitcoin in 2013 when it started, and it was like a cent per Bitcoin. Then I sort of got interested in 2014, started mining, but it was like $10 a coin. I'm not going to spend $10 on an invisible thing. It's a waste of money. So I missed that one. Then 2017 happened. It was $3,000 a coin. That's a lot of money for something invisible. I'm not wasting my money on that. Then there was 2020. It was $20,000 a coin. And then, was it last week? $111,000 a coin? I missed the boat. But here's the question. I'm not saying buy Bitcoin. Don't get me wrong. My question is, what's the chance that last one's going to happen? It's either a hoax or it's supernatural. But here's the question that I ask myself. That's all great, but all of that is in the past. I don't live in Babylon's time, Medo-Persia, Greece, and so on and so on. What about this time that we're living in? So I want to take you on a real whirlwind tour to Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, thereabouts. There was a person called Jesus Christ. He's in the New Testament. He's in the book of Matthew. And he comes along, and his disciples ask him some really poignant questions about the future from their perspective. And Jesus makes 3 interesting category of predictions. He says, here's some predictions about Jerusalem. Here's some about the temple in Jerusalem. Here's some about the Jewish nation. And I want you to see how he words these things, because I think what he was describing is the last moments that we're living in also. Let me show you. His friends, the disciples, they come to him and said, tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the what? End of the world. In their mind, it has to be the end of the world for this stuff to happen. So Jesus comes back and he says, listen, all these things or these signs are the beginning of birth pains or labor pains, depending on the English translation you have. Now, I am blessed to have 2 children that my wife gave birth to, not me. So I have witnessed labor pains proxy. And what's fascinating is that there are a couple of characteristics of labor pains, and I'm going to simplify it, so don't get upset, ladies, if you've had children, you say, I didn't do it justice. I know it was painful. But here's the point. They start off at some point, and over time, they get closer to each other, the contractions, and over time, the contractions get more in what? Intense. Okay, so that's sort of the pattern that Jesus is talking about. He says, listen, I'm going to tell you a bunch of things that are going to happen, and this is what you're looking for. And then he says, but to add to that, learn the parable from the fig tree. And the idea is watching the fig bud from a bud into the fruit. And what's interesting with these two examples that Jesus gives before he gives us his answers is that both of these examples, the giving birth or the fig bud, is that they're both visible. They're both what? Visible. Which means you have to open your eyes to see it. Number two, they're progressive. It means that they continue to progress through time. Does that make sense? And the third thing is they're climactic, which means that there is an event at the end of the season, whether it's the baby or whether it's the fig. Does that make sense? So what we're looking for as we look at these indicators that Jesus gives us, over time we're looking for a frequency increase and an intensity increase, which will all end up being visible, progressive, and climactic. Does that make sense? So Jesus is now describing to his followers in his day what the last time will be before the end of the world, okay? Because Daniel gives us a big picture timeline. The good news is you don't have to wait long in Daniel's story because you're living at the right point, right before the rock comes. But then Jesus sort of takes a magnifying glass and zooms in on that to give you more clarity. And so what he does, he gives us 5 signs, 5 category of signs to know when the increase happens in frequency and increase happens in intensity. You'll know that you're right near the climax. And the climax is the great big stone cut out without hands, which was the second coming or the last empire. So here are the 5 signs very quickly. Number 1, there'll be signs in the natural world to watch, according to Jesus. Now watch this. This is what he says. He says there will be earthquakes in various places. All right, but there's always been earthquakes. That's what I said, and I've heard that 1,000 times as well. But here's what Time magazine says. It says the number of known earthquakes and deadly earthquakes has dramatically increased in the last 100 years or so. That's Time magazine. So what are they saying there? They're saying that in the last 100 years, what's happened? Increasing in both frequency and deadliness. Let me show you a graph from the United States Earthquake Study Center. These are all the earthquakes that are magnitude 5 or greater, and that's a pretty big deal. Have you been in an earthquake of magnitude 5? I have. I've been on a 6.7. I was in Taiwan when Fukushima hit, and we felt it in Taiwan. It wasn't the same scale they had there, but Taiwan's on the same fault line, and man, it's not a nice feel. It's weird. Like literally, like everything's moving under your feet. But notice this. This is the last 100 years or so, and these are magnitude 5 or greater. These are decent earthquakes. Can you see visually a pattern? What can you see? On this scale, you have 5 to 10. And on this scale, you have 1900 to the year 2020. And what do you see? You see there's a big intensity of dots getting more and more thicker towards time as it goes on. Same idea, intensity and frequency. Then he says there will also be famines in the natural world. This is still sign number 1. Today, we've gotten to a point where there's 24,000 people, according to the United Nations, who die every single day because they're hungry. We're told that there are 925 million, again by the United Nations, who go to bed hungry. Absolutely crazy to think. I mean, how many of you are hungry tonight? I mean, if you are, talk to these guys and they'll feed you next door. I hope. It's pretty hard to imagine that many people being hungry. And yet the reason is it's famine, yes, but it's also because of our greed in the West as well. But he goes on in the natural world, he says there will be the seas and there'll be waves roaring. In some translations it says tidal waves and tsunamis. Look at some of the crazy Time magazine covers that we've had over the years. We've seen tsunami warnings, we've seen tragedy of hurricanes, and it seems like something's going crazy in intensity and frequency in our world. Again, none of these is the silver bullet. You don't count how many earthquakes and go, oh, that means Jesus is coming. That's not what he's trying to show. He's trying to show that everything in nature is going to get turned upside down the closer we get to the last moments before the supernatural event. And then he says this. He says there'll be pestilence. Pestilence is an old word which literally means viruses and plagues. I started tracking this stuff in the early 2000s when I was becoming interested in this sort of prophecy. And this is what I found. In 2003, do you remember mad cow disease? Yeah, so that was the first one I remember. There's probably more before this. In 2003, mad cow disease came along. Started in the UK, it went to other parts of the world. And then at the end of 2003, it was SARS. And I was traveling through Asia, and you had to it was just like COVID, to be honest. You had to put the mask on, your temperature check at the airport, the whole deal, except in Australia. And so we had this SARS thing in Asia, and it wasn't great. And then bird flu hit us. Again, mostly in Asia at this point. That wasn't great. The church that I was working in Taiwan, we were shut down for a couple of weeks because bird flu was an outbreak in Taipei City. And then, if that wasn't enough, we all got hit by swine flu up there as well. I mean, it was just one thing after another after another. And then, after swine flu, we had MERS. MERS was the Middle Eastern version of COVID. It hit all the Arabic-type speaking countries. And then after MERS, which pretty much disappeared in 2018, we had the Ebola breakout in South America. There was also the Zika, which I don't have a slide for, in South America. Look, it's this idea of plagues and pestilence increasing. It seems to be a lot happening around us in the last 20 years. Do I dare show the next slide? The famous painting. 2020, COVID-19. In 2020, they reported them in Africa as being plagues of biblical proportion of locusts. Insane. And then in 2022, there was the scare of monkeypox. Good thing it didn't turn out to be what many thought it might. Here's a graph from an independent website called Our World in Data. Go Google it, ourworldindata.org. They have data on everything you can possibly imagine. It's got nothing to do with religion, it's all about data. And on this website, it shows you graphs on different categories. And so this is globally reported natural disasters by type from 1970 to 2022. You can see the pattern, right? Increases, increases. Here's the next category. So we saw the natural world. Jesus says there's signs in the political world. So we should expect to see stuff happening on a bigger scale in the natural world. That's his first point. Second point is, now look over here in the political world and you'll see stuff happening there at the same time as that stuff over there. Does that make sense? So notice this. He says, you'll hear of wars and rumors of wars. Rumors of wars is an interesting expression because what it means is the wars don't happen, but they're constantly talking about the possibility of war happening. Do you know what that creates? Uncertainty and fear and panic. Sometimes the fear of war is enough stress that is different, or what's different to real war, but you get the idea. He goes on and says that nations will be against nations and kingdoms against kingdoms. It's not going to be pretty. And while that's all happening over here, don't forget all the stuff happening in the natural world as well. Yeah? In Revelation chapter 11, this is also Jesus speaking, he says that right before that last empire arrives, he says the nations will be what? Angry. I don't know if you've noticed this. Maybe because you all live in Kingscliff, it might be different down here. You're more chill, I can feel it down here. But I've noticed that people are a lot more miserable and angry and on edge and easily offended. Like just sit on a train in Sydney sometime, if you dare. People are angry. There's something that's changed. It's like we're all looking for a reason to be upset because of what you posted on TikTok or something. It's a different world that we're living in. I want you to notice, this is, according to the United Nations, this is the active conflict zones as of the end of 2023. If you just scan your eye across the globe there, what do you notice? Most of the planet is in an active conflict. So Jesus is saying, look for these indications that things are pretty difficult and messed up in the natural world. It's going to get bad. And over here in the political world, it's not going to be pretty either. So then he turns our attention to the social world. He says, because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. He's making a prediction that as you're wanting to know the answer of what the world's going to be like, what the indications will be like before our return, well, here's one of them. The world is going to be lawless. That means they get rid of the laws. And their love for each other will go very cold. Have you again, Kingscliff is a great place as a shining beacon of Australian hope and peace and prosperity. But if you go to other parts of this country, other parts of this planet, there's a lot of angry people, hating on people. Something's changed in the world. And I'm not that old. Some of you are older than me. I can tell your hair's grayer than mine. It's changing, isn't it? Have you seen it in your own lifetime? Yes. And so Jesus is saying, listen, there's stuff happening in the political, there's stuff happening in the environmental, there's stuff happening in the social. Just watch. The progressive indication is it's getting more unlike the place you want to live. And he continues, he says, this is his friend Paul. Paul speaking about the same time period. He says, know this, that in the last days, perilous times will come, for men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving. Some of you don't know how to forgive. You hold on to the hurt and the pain and people that have caused you, and it's making you sick. But it's a sign of the time. He goes on and says, there'd be brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong and haughty. Give you an example. This shock, I'm a parent. I'm a parent of little kids. I've got a 3-year-old and an 8-year-old. And this statistic I'm going to show you right now, it shocked me. It horrified me. Look at this. This is the United States. The average number of kids killed every year by their parents is 500. Could you imagine 500 kids waking up one day and then being dead that night because of the very person that brought them into this world? That to me is shocking that that's even possible. Like maybe 5, but 500? That's the United States. I don't have the data in Australia, but I do have this data in Australia. In Australia, 1 in 6 boys, 1 in 4 girls, you can read the rest yourself. That is disgusting. Yes or no? Something is wrong with our world. We're living in a time where everything around us is not the way it's supposed to be. And we're hurting, we're suffering, there's pain, there's sorrow. Someone told me in the medical profession in Australia that the number one prescription in this country, now I'm just saying what he told me, I don't know if it's true or not, but I'm just saying, I believe it probably is true, is antidepressants. And that's the legal one. The non-legal one is ice, because people escape reality through these substances. Something's wrong in the world that we're living in. It's not the same world that your grandparents grew up and their grandparents grew up. I'm not saying everything was better back in the old days. I'm just saying that we're now in a different time that looks remarkably similar to what this man Jesus talked about. Here's number 4. We only got 5. Number 4, Jesus says, watch in the religious world. Now this one, if this wasn't so serious, it would be funny. Watch this. He says, there shall arise false Christs and false prophets and show great signs and wonders. I read that and I'm like, yeah, right. Who in their right mind is going to come and say, I'm Jesus? Right? Who's going to do that? I'll show you. Here's the Siberian Jesus. You can get on a plane today, you can fly to Siberia, and you can meet Siberian Jesus. There's 250,000 people that think that that man is Jesus Christ. Unbelievable. It gets better. This is Miami Jesus. The funny thing with Miami Jesus is that he said that he is the sinful Jesus. The Jesus of Nazareth was the sinless Jesus, and he's the sinful Jesus. And the way to be a follower of him is you tattoo yourself with 666 and you indulge in all the passions. He had 1.6 million followers in South America. And everyone believed that he was Jesus reincarnated until he died. How do you have 1.6 million people believe that this man is Jesus Christ? But it gets better. Here is South African Jesus. He's preaching at his own wedding, and all of his kids and his wife fall asleep at his preaching. But he came to tell us that he's back, Jesus. He has 40 disciples. Here's Zambian Jesus. He's a taxi driver by day, and during the day he teaches everyone gets into his taxi how that he is Jesus returned. Gets even better, he's Tokyo Jesus. Tokyo Jesus, he was running for mayor, he lost the election, and then all of a sudden he had an epiphany, he's Jesus Christ. But my favorite one, and that's sarcasm, is Queensland Jesus. He's so famous. By the way, he's South Australian, but he's living in Queensland right now, so I can't take all the credit for his problems. He was on 7 News, I think last year or year before, and the title that they ran with was, and he said, I'm Jesus, deal with it. And the funny thing is that he met Mary Magdalene as well, and they're married, living in Kilcoy. There are people that live on his property with him who believe that he is Jesus Christ. Unbelievable. And then Jesus says this, he says, when the Son of Man comes, not if, but when, will he find faith on the earth? In our recent census in Australia, faith, or whatever shape or form, it's going like that on the census. How did he know this? He says, listen, watch the environmental, watch the political, watch the society, and watch the religious. And the 5th sign he gives us is, watch the financial. If you were here last night, we covered that, and we looked at this one characteristic of many characteristics. Here's one. It says, there'll be a time will be global economic control. We're walking into that right now as we speak. So the 5 signs that Jesus gives about the time from his perspective, right before his return, he says there'll be natural, political, social, religious, and financial. Now, if you put that and overlay it to Daniel's timeline, we have these 6 predictive elements all fulfilled. We're living in this time here of Daniel with the divided Europe trying to come to unite, but not working, and then trying again, not working. And then as we write down in the toenails, so to speak, of this last empire arrival, he says there's going to be these 5 characteristics in the world at that time. I'd like to suggest, you don't have to believe me, but just consider this, that there's a very real possibility that you might be actually experiencing a world that's been predicted for almost 2,000 years. Very real possibility. And as I've said numerous times in the last 3 presentations, this is all a hoax. You can go home and just forget it and take the blue pill and wake up feeling better tomorrow and forget all of this. Or you can take the red pill and go, this may actually be supernatural. And if it is supernatural, it warrants my time, as in your time, to actually investigate this stuff for myself. Let me ask you a question. Now I don't know what you believe and what you don't believe right now. Don't care really. You're listening. You can make up your own mind. But let me say this. If there is a possibility that this stuff is the real deal, doesn't it at least deserve your attention to at least check it out? Yes or no? That's what I thought. And that's what I started to do. I was like, man, there's too many patterns here. Daniel 8, Daniel 2, Revelation. There's too many patterns here where it seems like there's too much coincidence for it all to be a hoax. Perhaps we're doing something supernatural. And what I was most impressed about this prophecy is this. This prophecy claims that the author, this God of Daniel, that he knows the future. That's the claim, right? It seems to be pretty legit. He seems to know what he's talking about. And so the claim is that this God of the Bible, he knows the future. But here's the implication for me and for you. Here's the implication. If he knows the future, then he knows your future. Right? How can he not know the future as this great big collective thing and not know the individual futures in it? And so now this distant deity of this dusty old manuscripts, now he becomes personal, relational. And over the course of the next couple of presentations, especially tomorrow night, you won't want to miss that one, I'm going to show you how the intellectual facts and figures of the past and the dusty stuff of the past intersected with my actual life in 2002, and changed my perception of everything. That's tomorrow night. So, before we wrap up for tonight, I think you all got a little card. Now, I want to tell you about these cards. This is my idea. I like doing these cards. These cards, they look like this. You all got one of these cards? If not, there's some people that give you a card. I believe in decision making. Like I used to work in corporate, and in corporate, you don't leave a meeting without having an action plan. Otherwise, the meeting was a waste of time. There has to be an action plan. And so this is more for you than it is for me. In fact, it's almost entirely for you. The point is, I'm going to give you 3 options each night. Not really options, but 3 things to think about. So number 1, number 2, number 3. And I want you to take out a pen, and I want you to check 1, 2, or 3 based on what I put on the screen. So I'm going to ask you something. I tell you what, the first one's really, really easy. The first one is, did you understand tonight's topic? If you did, you check number 1, right? But just wait. And then, on some of the ticks, there's an option for you to connect with either a free giveaway, a book or something we're going to give away, or to ask questions. And in those cases, I'd encourage you to put your name and some sort of contact so that we can follow up and get those resources to you. I don't get paid for you to come here. I'm not going to make any money out of this at all, so don't worry about it. I'm not trying to get your details. I couldn't care less, to be honest. I just want to share what my journey's been. So if you put your name on there to start with, and if you want to put your address or email or phone, you're welcome to. But here's what I want you to think about tonight. 3 things to think about. Number 1, as I said before, if you understood tonight's topic, I want you to tick number 1. Just put a big old tick on there. Or you can color it in. Some people like to do crosses. I don't care what you do. Just indicate number 1. You understood the topic. And if you didn't understand it, you could leave it blank and then put a note on there and say, that really was bad. I need you to explain it better next time. Helps me. Okay, does that make sense? Fair enough? All right, number 2, if you would like to know this Daniel's God, or the God of Daniel from this story that we've talked about, which seems to know the future pretty clearly, I just want you to tick number 2. Now that's for you, not for me. I don't even get these cards, to be honest. So you tick number 2 if you want to know the same God that Daniel had, the one that seems to know not just collective history and collective future, but individual. Tick number 2. Now, number 3. We have a gift that we will give to you if you want it, and it's a video. Believe it or not, this is a video. It comes digitally, and it comes with a sort of a study guide, or it sort of has notes on the sort of parts of the topic I covered today. So if you would like to get it, so what this is, you'll get this, and it will give you access to watch it's about a 25-minute docudrama. Heard of a docudrama? It's like a reenactor sort of drama sort of thing. And it's about the topic tonight, that Daniel 2 image. If you'd like to have that as your own resource, then I want you to tick number 3. So it's called Kingdom Come. So tick number 3, and then someone will give you the access to watch this resource, and you'll get some form of a study notes and material for it. So yeah, obviously if you want number 3, we need to know how to contact you. So put your contacts on there. So here's what I ask you to do. Tick which ones are appropriate for you, and then as you're leaving, there'll be some helpers out there with some baskets. You just drop it in there, and then that's it. So I have one question for you. Did you understand tonight's topic? Yes. Good. Did you enjoy tonight's topic? Yes. Awesome. Well, tomorrow night, I'm going to take you on a journey that literally changed my life. All the stuff so far I've shared with you last night and tonight was all information gathering that I was doing. Tomorrow night, I'm going to share with you what was the moment that I became a believer. If I can do air quotes on that, a believer. I'm going to tell you the same story, the exact story. There was an exact moment that it became all real. It wasn't just facts and figures and history. That's tomorrow night. So tomorrow night, we're going to talk about the curse of the forbidden prophecy, same time, same place at 7 p.m. Friday night. And then on Saturday morning, we'll be joining with the Kingscliff Church here at 11 o'clock. So it won't be Saturday night because I have to get on a plane and fly to Adelaide on Saturday night. So they're gracious. They're letting me do it at 11 o'clock on Saturday. So if you would like to join us, They'll be having study groups and things before that, but then I think it's before, is it? And then at 11 o'clock, I'll be sharing this topic of the divine constitution. A fascinating topic. And then we're going to take a break until Wednesday because I have to go to Adelaide and then I have to go to Hobart and then I'll come back. And I'll be back on Wednesday, next Wednesday, 7 p.m. for Cosmic Conspiracy. The conspiracy of evil versus good. And you won't want to miss that. So, Robbie, over to you.
Awesome.
We've got a prize, I think, to give away.
Yeah, how many prizes do we have to give away?
I don't know. I haven't looked in the box.
I haven't either.
All right, let's have a look together. We're making up as we go.
I wrote down some quiz questions from the presentation, but I didn't know how many quiz questions I should ask.
So I've got, okay, we've got 2.
2, all right. Are you ready? So we'll do this raise of hand again. So here are 2 questions, and the first people up with the correct answer will get a prize. What's our first prize?
The hat.
A beautiful Faith FM hat. I like hats. Maybe I should compete. All right, who can remember right back at the beginning, what were Robbie's least favorite subjects in school? Excellent, history. Yes. Awesome. And the second question is, how many signs, categories of signs were there given? 5. Alex, awesome. Good on you. Awesome. We just want to say thank you so much to Robbie for the presentation. If you've enjoyed that, we just give a warm thank you. And we just want to encourage you. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow night. If you have anybody that you'd like to bring, everyone is welcome. We'll see you here at 7 o'clock New South Wales time tomorrow evening. There are some refreshments outside that you can enjoy. I encourage you to just have a chat. There are also those resources on the way out, or if you have questions for Robbie, he'll be around. Be blessed. Have a good evening. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow night.